Hello and welcome to this segment on the world of international trade and capital flows. Not too much to get through here, but there's a couple of key concepts to be aware of. We're going to do some numbers on it. It's absolute versus comparative advantage, but it's more the concept you need to be happy with, and we're illustrating it with numbers. That's the way I'd look at it, rather than worrying too much about doing these calculations yourself. Then a little bit of chat on just models of trade, which are quite nice, I think. So here we go. First up, GDP and Gnp. In the world of macroeconomics, we pretty much talk GDP consistently to death. It's all about GDP, the value of goods and services produced in a country. So it's everything produced in the country. That means anything by your citizens and foreigners working in that country. As opposed to GNP, that's the value of goods and services produced by a country's citizens and their capital. So that would include any citizens working abroad outside your borders, but not any foreigners within your country. So I often ply my trade in New York, originally from the UK, as you can probably tell from the accent. So UK citizen still, whilst I'm in the US, whatever I produce there, that is part of US GDP, but it would be part of the UK's GNP. What do you need to do with those definitions? Learn them and throw them at the examiner if he asks. That's about it. All right, let's get into the main feast. The benefits and costs of international trade. Is international trade a good thing? Well, the answer is yes. And most people are aware of that. Sadly, these days, not everybody, but let's not go there. The benefits, lower cost to consumers of imports. Consumers benefit from international trade and higher employment, wages and profits in the industries that are exporting. Now the downside, and this is clearly where it gets a little bit political, the displacement of workers and lost profits in industries competing with those imports. But if you are thinking from a global point of view, international trade is a good thing. And the concepts I mentioned up front that we need to get comfortable with are those of absolute and comparative advantage. So, absolute. If you have the absolute advantage in producing goods, so just think of it as a country, if you have the absolute advantage in producing goods, you can do it at the lowest cost in terms of the resources you need. So the resource we're going to look at in the example is labor. So if you have absolute advantage, you can make a product with the lowest amount of labor. However, what we should really focus on is comparative advantage. That is the lowest opportunity cost to produce. Opportunity cost means best alternative foregone. Now, absolute and comparative can give you different answers. And the law of comparative advantage says this: trade can make all countries better off, regardless of who has the absolute advantage. And that's a classic trap question. If the examiner throws at you a country that has absolute advantage in everything, he may try and tell you they could not possibly benefit from trade. Not true. You can still benefit from comparative advantage. What should you do? Every country should specialize in goods they produce most efficiently, meaning lower opportunity cost, and trade for other goods. Outcome, increased worldwide output and wealth, with nobody being worse off. What could go wrong with that? Let's illustrate it. So here we have Portugal and England. And look at the information you've got. Make sure you know how the information is being presented here if you're asked to analyze and talk about it. So we have here output per labor hour. Look at the units we're talking about. Output per labor hour. So let's focus on Portugal cloth. Initially, what this is telling us is that in 1 labor hour, Portugal can produce 100 yards of cloth. So in 1 labor hour, Portugal spits out 100 yards of cloth. In that same labor hour, they could instead produce 110 bottles of wine. So Portugal has a labor hour sat there, trying to decide how to employ that hour, Either they spend that labour hour making 100 yards of cloth or 110 bottles of wine. England, for the same labour hour, could produce 90 yards of cloth or 80 bottles of wine. So, the unprepared candidate who's not been through this material presented with that information says, well, this is a done deal. Portugal is clearly better at everything. And that's true. Portugal has the absolute advantage in wine and cloth. In that same labour hour, it produces more cloth and more wine. But don't go down the track of saying, therefore, we should never trade. Not true. Because we should be considering comparative advantage. To do that, we're going to have to compute opportunity cost. So we are going to start with cloth. And let's start by looking at England. As I say, I don't think you'd be asked to do these calcs in detail, but understanding them is definitely helpful. So we're looking at England and their opportunity cost of cloth. Opportunity cost, as I say, is best alternative foregone. So we are going to spend an hour producing cloth. All right, what do we miss out on? Well, if we decide to dedicate our hour to making cloth, England will come up with 90 yards. What has it missed out on? Well, it could have spent that same hour making 80 bottles of wine. So the calculation we say is this. I've missed out on 80 bottles of wine in order to make 90 yards of cloth. 80 over 90, that means for every yard of cloth we make, so you could put this, if you liked, as per yard of cloth. For every yard of cloth we come up with, we are foregoing missing out on 0.89 bottles of wine. Do the same calc for Portugal. So, if I clear it out, for Portugal, they are missing out on 110 bottles of wine by making 100 yards of cloth in that hour. They miss out on 1.1 bottles of wine, again per yard of cloth. So who has the comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is the lowest opportunity cost. To make a single yard of cloth, England only misses out on 0.89 of a bottle. To make the same yard of cloth, Portugal misses out on 1.1 bottles. Therefore, England has the lowest opportunity cost and the comparative advantage. Now, in this beautiful example, with 2 countries and 2 products, it's pretty straightforward to see who has the comparative advantage in wine. Because we're just flipping these numbers over. So it's 100 over 110 and 90 over 80. If Portugal chooses to spend its labour hour making wine, comes up with 110 bottles, only missed out on 100 yards of cloth, 0.91. England misses out on 90, only made 80, 1.13. Therefore, the lowest opportunity cost for wine is Portugal. We then apply the law of comparative advantage and we say England should make cloth and Portugal should make wine. And both and the world will be a better place for it. And this is proof. So, looking at those output figures, let's imagine Portugal decides to dedicate 9 hours to wine. What would happen? Well, if it dedicates 9 hours to wine, it can make 110 bottles per hour, 990 bottles in 9 hours. It's foregoing 9 hours of cloth. It's missing out on 900 yards of cloth. If England spends 10 hours on cloth, well, it's going to come up with 800, so it misses out on that 800. If instead it spends its 10 hours making 90 yards of cloth, 900. Those two cancel out, and we are left with a gain of 190 bottles of wine. The world is better off. So, what's our conclusion? Specialization. Portugal specializes in wine because it has the comparative advantage. England specializes in cloth. So, because they're specializing, they should get more efficient, they should gain. They should also benefit from economies of scale. And the cross-border competition just generally makes people get better. But clearly, you can't have this situation where Portugal makes nothing but wine and England nothing but cloth. Everybody in England is fully clothed but with no alcohol. Everyone in Portugal is in a very different situation. So we then need the cross-border trade. So we specialize, get these gains, and then trade. And the world is a better place. That's the main concept. As I say, I don't think you'll get heavy numbers, but it's important to understand what's going on. Last two slides just give us a couple of models of trade to look at. The Ricardian and the Heckscher-Ohlin model. Pretty easy to remember. Ricardian, invented by one economist, one factor of production. Heckscher-Ohlin, two factors of production. It's a little bit more involved. The Ricardian is really straightforward. It says, look, the only factor of production we're going to consider is labor. And the question here is, who has the comparative advantage? Well, whoever has the better labor productivity. If you have higher labor productivity for a product, you will have the comparative advantage. End of model. Pretty straightforward. HO model, two factors, capital and labor. And here the comparative advantage depends on the relative amount of each factor. So the argument is you will have the comparative advantage in very labor-intensive goods if you have a huge labor force, as opposed to the comparative advantage in capital-intensive if you have more capital. That sets the scene, but we also, on the next slide, need to go into a little bit more detail on the mechanics of it. And it looks like this. Under the HO model, each country then specializes in the good that requires more of the more abundant resource. So, huge labor force, focus on labor-intensive goods. So, example in the underlying readings talks about fabrics. You have a country with a huge labor force, and you can make these very elaborate, nice, handmade fabrics because you have the labor to do it. So they will specialize and increase total output. The argument is that output starts to get exported, and there is a derived demand because you're now exporting it. People want that product. There's a derived demand. The price of that abundant resource should increase. Wealth gets transferred to that abundant resource. They benefit from this export market for these fabrics. That's the idea. So you get this wealth transfer into the labor force away from the capital.